By now, in part 4 of this deep dive into men's advocacy, the groundwork is clear. Women's movements gained traction through empathy and organization, while men's advocacy remained fragmented and stigmatized. In part 1, we uncovered how women built powerful, organized movements while men never really formed anything comparable, and how that silence still defines gender politics today. In part 2, we exposed the empathy economy, showing how society rewards female pain but punishes male vulnerability. In part 3, we broke down why men stay silent even when they do see and experience imbalance, and how shame, fear, and reputation keep them from standing together. Now in part 4, we turn to power, policy, and perception, including how influence, funding, and framing decide who actually gets help. And this is where ideology turns to infrastructure, where sympathy becomes funding and funding becomes influence. The question isn't just who hurts, it's who gets help once they do hurt. Institutionalization gave women's movements a head start that no men's organization has ever matched. Beginning in the 1960s, governments worldwide created formal offices for women's affairs, for gender commissions, and equality task forces. In the United States, President Kennedy established the first Commission on the Status of Women in 1961, chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt, which led to a wave of state and federal initiatives focused on employment, equity, childcare, and education. Within 2 decades, the United Nations followed with the Commission on the Status of Women, later creating UN Women as a global agency with billions of dollars in annual funding. These entities didn't just lobby, they actually wrote legislation, they directed budgets, and they defined the moral vocabulary of gender itself. No equivalent apparatus has ever existed for men. There is no Office of Men's Affairs, there's no United Nations counterpart, and no federal men's commission with authority to shape policies and priorities. The imbalance isn't just theoretical, it's bureaucratic fact. The money follows this legitimacy as well. Philanthropic foundations, development agencies, and even corporate initiatives overwhelmingly frame gender equity as a female-centered mission. Just a few years ago, a 2020 Foundation Center report found that less than 1% of global gender-focused funding was directed primarily at men or boys. Yes, you did hear that right. And most of that went to youth violence or fatherhood mentoring. Yeah, that's right. Teaching men what they should be doing as fathers, not structural advocacy. By contrast, programs supporting women's empowerment, their maternal health, and their workplace equality routinely receive large-scale institutional backing. The reasons here are not malicious, I don't think. They're just, in fact, cultural. Female-focused causes align with empathy, with safety and protection, while male-focused causes often appear political, defensive, or even unnecessary, as I've mentioned. When an organization calls itself for women, it's seen as humanitarian. When one calls itself for men, it's treated as ideological. And legal advocacy reflects this same asymmetry. The National Coalition for Men, one of the few persistent male rights organizations, has achieved occasional courtroom victories. Their 2008 case in California forced that state to acknowledge that domestic violence funding could not exclude male victims, and their 2019 selective service lawsuit challenged the constitutionality of requiring only men to register for the draft. But these policies are isolated, not symmetric. No follow-up policy structure emerged, no referral federal funding stream was created, and certainly no widespread public conversation has followed any of it. In contrast, women's and feminist legal advocacy, from the National Organization for Women to the American Civil Liberties Union's Women's Rights Project, built entire empires and departments inside government and academia, thereby producing generations of scholars, policymakers, and administrators who turned activism into career infrastructure. Feminism became an industry. Men's advocacy remained a hobby. Public perception amplifies this divide. Advocating for women's causes is viewed as moral progress, right? Well, advocating for men's causes is often seen as a moral regression. The media reinforces this through framing bias of their own. Stories about women's inequality emphasize vulnerability, hope, and collective repair. Yet stories about men's inequality emphasize controversy, blame, toxicity, or that, well, we still need to consider both sides of the balance. When a university announces a new women's leadership center, it receives glowing coverage. When a university proposes a men's mental health initiative, which is extremely rare, it's met with suspicion out of motives or inclusivity. The same dynamic applies in even corporate diversity programs. Gender parity is measured almost exclusively by how many women occupy leadership positions, not by whether men suffer unique disadvantages in education, suicide, or social isolation. In this way, the definition of even gender equity itself has become institutionally feminized. Politics follow perception. Female advocacy groups can influence elections, shape party platforms, and mobilize millions and millions of citizens. Movements like Me Too, Time's Up, and women's marches not only command media cycles, but also altered legislation on workplace harassment and corporate compliance. Male-oriented activism rarely penetrates mainstream politics, except when it's used rhetorically by others, either as caricature or opposition. Politicians can safely align with women's organizations because those symbolize compassion and progress. Yet aligning with men's organizations invites scrutiny. This asymmetry of social reward means that even male legislators hesitate to speak on men's issues unless it's framed through neutral language like mental health or public safety. And that linguistic self-censorship keeps men's policy advocacy trapped in euphemism, unable to name itself without triggering resistance. The net effect is a feedback loop. Institutions respond to moral pressure follows empathy, and empathy follows narrative. Women's advocacy has mastered all of those. Men's advocacy is not institutionalized, so each failed attempt reinforces the perception that no legitimate movement exists. Without visibility, donors do not invest. Without investment, credibility declines, and without credibility, media attention fades. So listen, this is not a conspiracy, it's a cycle. The gender gap in policy is not just about ideology, it's about infrastructure built over decades through emotional branding, through institutional patience, and even strategic storytelling. By the end of this episode, what we see is that fairness is not distributed by truth or need. It's distributed by narrative capital. Women's movements hold moral authority and bureaucratic permanence. Men's hold frustration and footnotes. So the next question, and the focus on the final part of this deep dive in part 5 coming up soon, is what would it take for men to rebuild legitimacy on their own terms? How can a movement form around responsibility instead of resentment? Again, that's where we're going in part 5. That's how the system was built. Decades of empathy, funding, and narrative, turning one movement into policy and the other into just background noise. But what institutions ignored, men have rebuilt on their own. So in part 5, we'll look at how change is already happening outside the system, how men have created their own network of education, mentorship, and awareness that's quietly reshaping culture faster than any politics ever could.